Moses is regarded as the one who freed God's people from Egyptian slavery and the leader of the Exodus. He was the one to whom God gave the law. In John 3:14 and 15, Jesus gave an example of how Moses foreshadowed his own activity as the Messiah. Hebrews 11 lists Moses as an example of faith. We learn that God himself buried Moses in Deuteronomy 34. Moreover, it is stated that since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For no one has ever showed the mighty power, nor performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Deuteronomy 34 verses 10 and 12. Yet despite all his blessings, Moses was denied entry to the Promised Land. Why? It all began in a place called Meribah. Moses struck the rock twice, instead of speaking to it as God had instructed him. God punished him for this. Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. Numbers chapter 20 verse 12. But the story of Meribah had not started here. Let's examine Meribah's location, what transpired there, and the reasons Moses' actions there prevented him from reaching Canaan. Meribah in the Bible. The Bible makes two mentions of Meribah, also known as Massah. Actually, the Israelites passed through two Meribahs on their journey, Meribah and Meribah Kadesh. The miracle of water occurs in both places. Massah is an Arabic word, meaning temptation. The Israelites provoked the Lord in this place, hence its name. Meribah, which means war or contention, certainly seems appropriate given how Israelites behaved before the water miracle. According to the Bible, the Meribah where Moses disobeyed God and was punished is located in the desert of Zin. Although we don't know the precise location, we do know it was before the Israelites arrived in the Promised Land. The journey from Egypt to Canaan was a hard one. It required a lot of endurance and faith in Moses as their leader and God as their ultimate savior. However, the Israelites lost sight of this crucial journey ahead because they were so engrossed in the challenges of the wilderness, as did Moses, whose annoyance with them ultimately prevented him from entering the Promised Land. These passages will seem familiar, but it's crucial to recognize the small distinctions between them and how the latter one had much more serious repercussions. Exodus 17 contains the first instance. The Israelites complained about Moses' failure to provide them with water. They also put God to the test by claiming that if he was truly with them, he was supposed to provide them with water. Moses felt pressured and asked God what to do. The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. Exodus 17, verses 5 and 6. Water flowed out of the rock, and the Israelites had a drink. It was a miracle. The Israelites basically came to Moses with a difficult situation. Moses approached God. He then received clear instructions from God. He followed these instructions and the problem was solved. Let's now see what happened when Moses loses his patience and disregarded God at the second Meribah, the second incident. The second miracle is continued in Numbers 20. The Israelites reached the Zin Desert in the vicinity of Kadesh. They lamented their shortage of water to Moses once more. They even asserted that Moses should never have brought them out of Egypt. After all, pomegranates and figs were grown in Egypt. Observe how whenever they felt a little thirst, they temporarily forgot about their hardships from 400 years of slavery. Moses and Aaron asked God for guidance on what to do next. God gave very specific instructions. Numbers 20, verses 7 and 8. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for this community, so they and their livestock can drink." Moses, on the other hand, struck the rock twice. Moses' disobedience angered God, even though he went ahead to provide the Israelites with water. Ironically, Moses had just called the Israelites rebels, just before he smashed the rock in a disobedient manner. God punished Moses for this act. In Deuteronomy 32:51 and 52, God explained why he could not allow Moses to reach the promised land. This is because you broke faith with me in the presence of the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the desert of Zin, and because you did not uphold my holiness among the Israelites. Therefore you will see the land only from a distance. You will not enter the land I am giving to the people of Israel. God fulfilled his promise. He took Moses to see the promised land, but forbade him to go inside. It's unclear why Moses disobeyed God, but it was likely because of his frustration at the Israelites' constant whining. The verse doesn't explicitly state Moses had grown quite irritated with how much the Israelites grumbled, so he chose to hit the rock twice as instead of speaking to it. But in reality, it was the situation. He had grown impatient with the people of God. They constantly questioned his leadership, questioned God, and the essence of the whole journey. They were undoubtedly hard to deal with. For instance, when Moses left for some time to obtain the 10 Commandments, they made an idol and began to worship it. He had simply had enough, and in a fit of rage, he rebelled against God. The punishment. At first look, Moses striking a rock at the desert in disappointment at the Israelites doesn't appear like a justified reason for him to be barred from entering the Promised Land. After all, he had experienced the 10 plagues, led Israel out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, brought the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai, and saw many of Israel's successes in war. Why then would God not allow Moses to enter the land that he had promised Israel because of one mistake in Meribah? First, it was a distortion of God's plan. According to 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, God intended the rock in the desert to represent his Son, Jesus Christ. In Exodus 17, when the Lord commanded Moses to strike the rock, he was attempting to paint an image of Christ as our Redeemer. The Bible constantly states in Psalms and Isaiah that Christ is our cornerstone and rock, having been killed or struck for our sake, and promising to send forth streams of fresh water, or salvation. John 4, verse 10. Furthermore, according to Hebrews, Christ made an ultimate sacrifice for sin. Thus, no additional offering is necessary, since Jesus was only willingly sacrificed once to save us. The Lord only intended for Moses to strike the rock in the desert once in the Exodus 17 incident. To uphold that image painted in Exodus 17, the Lord directed Moses to only speak to the rock later in Numbers 20. Moses shattered the image painted in Exodus 17 when he decided to strike the rock again. If God had not corrected Moses' mistake, we might have been misled by the skewed picture and believed that Christ, the rock, had to be sacrificed or hit repeatedly for our redemption. God punished Moses in order to ensure that we fully comprehend the metaphor of the rock. In this manner, the Lord created a brand new image to help people comprehend salvation properly. The Lord demonstrated this by keeping Moses out of the Promised Land, so that we may know that it is only through the one act of Jesus on the cross that we can come into salvation, or the Promised Land. Let us realize that sin can keep us from entering the Promised Land. We must use caution to avoid sinning, and whenever we do, we ought to take our penalty with humility, just as Moses did. We lose sight of the seriousness of sin whenever we doubt God's penalties in the Bible or our own lives. Sin ultimately communicates to God that we don't believe He deserves to rule over our lives. And because we need Him, God, out of His love, corrects us when we sin. Secondly, Moses' disobedience was an act of distrust in God. Any general commentary will contain scholarly disputes concerning the precise fault for which Moses was punished, yet the text of Numbers 20, verse 12, expressly states the fundamental sin. You did not trust in me. His leadership failed at this critical juncture when he lost faith in God and began acting on his own whims. Moses would therefore not be allowed to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, since he did not uphold his holiness in front of the people. The Israelites were led by Moses out of slavery in Egypt through the desert and to Mount Sinai, where he was given the 10 Commandments. But he would not be permitted to enter the land of milk and honey for his lack of trust in God. Moses was instead told by God that he would only see the land from afar and would not enter it. Moses was punished as a result of his act of disobedience and for failing to adhere to God's exact directives. Despite his pleas, God refused to change his mind, displaying the seriousness of disobedience and confidence in his divine instructions. It's a scary responsibility to honor God in leadership, which is something that all Christian leaders in all spheres must strive to do. We must be cautious not to mistake our position of power for that of God, whether we are in charge of a household, a business, a school, a charity, or any other type of institution. Additionally, Moses claimed responsibility for creating the water. "Must we bring you water out of this rock?" he inquired of the crowd gathering around the rock. Numbers 20, verse 10. Instead of giving God the glory for the miracle, Moses and Aaron appeared to be taking credit for it themselves publicly. The Israelites could not be expected to comprehend God's holiness if he allowed evil to go unpunished, and thus God punished him. It's crucial to remember that despite receiving this penalty, Moses carried out his responsibility as the head of the Israelites right up until the end of his life. He accepted the punishment, and God was faithful enough to fulfill the promise he had made to him.